I didn't read a book on sales until I was probably 7 years later. And the reason I read it is I was the head of sales, and I was like, I better sound like I know what I'm talking about. There was a book I read that I relied on heavily, and I read it when I was 10. And it was How to Win Friends and Influence Others by Dale Carnegie. I was 10 years old. It was in my grandmother's closet. I read that, and I read Barry Goldwater's Mind of a Conservative. That's what kind of nerd I was, around the same time.
There you go.
Yeah. And so I honestly just used the things from that book, and it was very natural to me. And I remember I got to work with Andy Roddick a few years ago to help rebrand his foundation.
Sure.
And I asked him, when did he know he was going to be a tennis player? And he said that when his dad put the racket in his hand when he was 4 years old in Nebraska, and it just fit in his hand just perfectly. We built a whole campaign around Find Your Fit.
In a corporate world where all employees have great leaders with no egos that create fun cultures where people can do their best work, the employees and companies thrive while doing great things for the customers, themselves, and each other.
Well, we know that rarely happens. I'm Jeff Palacio. I have been a leader for over 40 years for every t-shirt size company, from small 16 employees to extra large over 1 million. Please join me while I interview outstanding leaders that will share stories of great leadership and not so great. It will help you become a better leader while poking fun about all the crazy shit that happens in corporate America.
Hi, I'm Joe Deshawn, and welcome to The Corporate Couch with Jeff Palacio. Today's episode is brought to you by Palacio and Partners, providing turnkey podcast creation, hosting, production, promotion, and related creative resources for you and your business. Today, Jeff is interviewing Justin Foster. Justin is the co-founder of Massive Change, an advisory firm providing executive coaching, leadership development, and brand strategy for nonprofit leaders and entrepreneurs who want to make the world a more just and equitable place. Justin is based in Austin, Texas, where he has spent over 2 decades delivering brand coaching to leaders across all industries and sectors. He is also the author of 4 books. You can learn more about Justin at massivechange.co. Let's listen as Jeff talks to Justin.
Justin, welcome to the Corporate Couch this morning.
Thank you, Jeff. Love the name of the podcast, by the way. As a branding guy, that's a good name.
Thank you. We met through Mackie Musavi and kind of Mark Schaefer. They kind of both introduced us at the same time. So yeah, I'm excited to talk to you. And we were talking before we hit record, and it's called the Corporate Couch. You're kind of the least corporate guy that's been on it.
I will take that as a compliment. Yeah.
Yes, and it absolutely is. No, I love your career, and we're going to get into some deep topics. I would, after one call we had, and now talking here briefly, you're a deep thinker, and I love your humanity and what you're trying to do. So we're going to get into some great conversation. But let's start with a fun question. You're very open on your platforms, your podcasts, your blogs that you do. But what people that know you even fairly well, Justin, what would surprise them about you?
Well, it's funny you say that, because when my partner Virginia and I got married back in November of 2023, my older son Logan, when he was given the remarks at the reception, he said, "What can I say about my dad that he already hasn't put on Instagram?" So
there you go.
I think that people that it's an interesting contrast, because if you don't know who I am, there's a lot of surprising things. It's just not a lot of people raised on a ranch, spent time in a Christian cult. Had a partner who, after 25 years of marriage, came out as gay. There's a lot of things in that story.
Yeah, that's a surprising one.
Yeah, so it's really just a matter as we go along here. I think that when, otherwise, I think the biggest surprise for people is the first 15 seconds thing, which is I look like, as a straight white American male, 54 years old, I look like the archetype of the kind of person that caused most of the problems in this country. and so I get mostly from progressives or people that are, on the political spectrum, suspicion.
Right.
Like, I don't know if you're doing the video on the podcast too, but I don't have hair. I mean, my head's shaved, and
Yeah.
I look like a typical white guy. And that's why I jokingly refer to myself as an enlightened redneck, because I still got
enlightened
redneck.
redneck. I like that.
Yeah. I still got redneck tendencies.
I'm a little bit older than you. So imagine me, I'm definitely,
right. But you got cool hair and you got a ethnic last name.
There you go.
Like,
there you go. I have cool hair.
So you have that. Yeah. You have cool hair, and you got a last name that ends in a vowel.
There you go. There you go. I love that. Yeah, this is great. So I know, because you are transparent, you grew up in a cattle ranch in Eastern Oregon. So what was fun for you growing up? What'd you love doing, Justin?
Well, Jeff, it was such a paradox. So my life has been very paradoxical, where the ranch life was mostly awesome. My home life was mostly not. And we were kind of reverse commuters. Like, we lived in town, but my dad went to the ranch. And that was also kind of a split. So I really wasn't seen as one of the ranch kids. I was more seen as a townie, in this little town of 10,000 people. But the home life was really defined by religion and extreme fundamentalism, Christianity, and violence and abuse. The ranch life was the escape from that. And so I have mostly positive memories of the ranch. And, I'll put it this way, like 70 years ago, I think that's about right, about over 50% of the population worked in agriculture. Now it's less than 2%.
Right.
So ranch roots, run deep in me, and it's indelible, these grooves about work ethic and the code of the West and all of those things. And they were kind of a counter to the abuse. And I'm so thankful for it, especially my grandparents. My grandfather was a very gruff man. I said at his memorial when he passed a number of years ago, he was the man that John Wayne was pretending to be.
Oh, wow.
And, he was, but my grandmother also, she was a Spitfire. She was 5 feet tall, and she was a feminist, even though she wouldn't call herself that. And she was the only person I felt safe around for many, many years. Of all the adults in my life, I didn't feel safe around any of them except for her. And she sort of got me. She understood me. And she was a very special person to me, that I don't know what I would have done without her.
Yeah. Yeah. What a gift she gave you. I know, like I said, I'm a little bit older than you. I'm being kind to myself, but, my parents, didn't know any better, so my discipline came through physical means, belt, a strap, a wooden spoon, whatever. I mean, was that the type of discipline you had as a kid?
Yeah. And it was, I'm opposed to that. And when I became a dad, many years ago now, I didn't, my main thing was just don't create a life don't create experiences that's anything like I experienced from feeling unsafe and all of that. And so, yes, there was that, but it was less about punishment. It wasn't about discipline. Discipline would have been easier to understand. It was about erratic spates of violence. So there's two kinds of PTSD. There's sort of PTSD that's shock-based, like a singular type event PTSD, which sucks. But there's also what's called complex PTSD, which is this basically chronic feeling of being unsafe. And it took me many, many years to get to therapy and inner work to kind of to reconcile that, because I already was a neurodivergent kid back before that was a term, in a highly sensitive nervous system, highly sensitive soul, put into a place where on one end with the church doctrine, you're told you're a piece of shit. That's what fundamentalism is, essentially, is you're a piece of shit.
Right.
And on the other end of it was the violence, and it was the unpredictability of it that was the worst part of it, honestly, because I never knew when it was going to happen, which is common with people that are, deal with bipolar or manic depressive disorders and things like that, and a lot of their own unresolved trauma. And thankfully, it was my mother that was the primary, source of this. About 2016, we really reconciled, and we became, I wouldn't even say we reconciled. We started a real relationship in 2016.
Wow.
That many years later. And I always give credit to my former business partner, Emily, who had a very close relationship with her parents. And she said, you try to repair it if you can, because at some point, you're not going to get a chance to. Anyway, so that's what happened. My dad was violent in a sort of like a irresponsible big brother way.
Right.
So I didn't fear him. I didn't respect him, but I didn't fear him either.
Right. Yeah. So while growing up, did you have any kind of things you loved doing, or was it just, it was hard because of the environment?
Yeah. I mean, some of it was, there's always things that you could find a little joy and these little things. Like I remember, like one of my favorite things was when I'd get home from school and nobody was home, and I would get a Louis L'Amour book, usually the Western author or something. Sure. I was a voracious reader, but I loved Louis L'Amour. I still have many of his books, the paperbacks, and I would disappear because in the fundamental Christianity, you're not allowed to own a TV. We were really sinners because we had a stereo and listen to Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson,
There you go.
And I look back, and that was sort of outlaw for them to do that, right. To listen to music. But we didn't have a TV, and so I read, and I spent hours in the library. And I didn't just read fiction; I read history, voraciously read history, like every history book I could get my hands on about any era of any time. And then I love to be outside. That was always very adventuresome. We grew up camping, and I grew up hunting with my dad and my uncle. And, I loved speed. So, early on, I learned how to ride a motorcycle and did all kinds of crazy shit on a motorcycle at the ranch, because it's wide open. I got that terrible motorcycle accident when I was 13 and broke my back and my jaw and all this stuff. So, but it was this sort of, I had ADHD, even obviously back then, even though we didn't know that's what it was. And ADHD is a dopamine deficiency. So I would do things that were risky in order to get a dopamine hit. And so I did a lot of stuff that was like climbing to the top of 100-foot tree, or I read The Great Escape, the book, that was turned into a movie, and decided I was going to dig a tunnel underneath the road by our house, like that kind of audacity, to do things like that. I was an audacious kid despite the environment. Not because of the environment.
Yeah. So interesting. So you graduate high school. What was kind of your thought process, and what was your kind of next steps after that? After that type of childhood and growing up experience.
Yeah. So I didn't get any guidance on this stuff. Like my parents didn't give me any guidance, and I sort of a cynical view of guidance counselors. Like if your job is to be a guidance counselor, you probably underachieved. Like that seems mean, but it's probably true. And and this was before like standardized testing and all that, where, you're going to be a certain thing. So, but one of the biggest moments is about halfway through my junior year, we moved from Baker City, Oregon, about 10,000 people, to Portland, which is much bigger now, but was still, still much bigger, 10 times bigger or more than Baker. And I graduated from high school. I was young. I was 17 when I graduated. I started, I was the youngest kid in my class, except for the times we had Asian foreign exchange students, and they were always younger than me. I went to Portland State for like 2 semesters, and it felt like high school, and I didn't enjoy it. And so I dropped out, and somewhere in there, before I graduated from high school in Gresham, Oregon, I had an opportunity to go to the Air Force Academy. All I had to do was keep a certain amount of grades, because a buddy of mine his dad was friends with the Senator Mark Hatfield. And there's a sort of early approval process, kind of nepotism, of course, but he was like, keep your grades there. And I was an honor student. I was in debate club. I won a lot of stuff in debate. And, so I was never an athlete, but I did the other stuff. But then I had my first girlfriend and everything went to shit. Actually, two things collided. I had my first girlfriend and then I ran into like real heavy math, like physics, and like calculus, excuse me.
Yeah.
And I just like, to this day, my brain just doesn't pretzel that way. And
Right.
I ended up with like I needed a 3.98 GPA, ended up with like a 3.91, and never went to the Air Force Academy. So
interesting.
And so I met my first wife, Lena, around that time. And in fundamentalism, especially back then, it's very common you get married so you can have sex. And we got married. I was 18, she was 19.
Oh, wow.
And Logan was born and 3 years later. And so at that point, I'm in it.
Right.
Everybody else is listening to Nirvana and, like going to college, and you see all the 90s movies from the early 90s I was trying to make a living to feed my family at that point.
Yeah. So where did you go, like professionally at that point? You're 18, 19, Logan's born 3 years after you get married. Like how'd you pick, like, I'm going to do this? Because I saw on your LinkedIn, one of your early jobs, it was a sales and marketing manager, and obviously you're a branding coach and have been for decades. But like, what was the progression into that space?
So I had got a job I enjoyed working for a temp service. I don't even know if those things are around still, because it gave me variety. And
I think
that's
they
what
still are, actually.
I was temping. I moved copiers. I worked at a call center for an alarm company. I did data entry. One of my favorite temp jobs is I got to work in the research lab at Nike, and where my job was to shred the prototypes. And I had like a top level, security to get into this place. And they would frisk me when you leave to make sure that you couldn't, to make sure you weren't taking prototypes with you.
Wow.
So that was fun. So just sitting there shredding prototypes and picking up like the scraps and, shredding them so that they weren't, stolen. And one of the jobs though I ended up with was with the Southland Corporation, which at the time was the owner of 7-Eleven. They've since been absorbed. And, I don't even know if Southland's still around, but I ended up in this giant company as the only male admin. And I had like 4 bosses, and I learned a ton in that process. I was the admin for the overall department of HR.
Wow.
And then the learning and development, the loss prevention, and the leadership. I don't remember, like 3 or 4. It was a long time ago.
Right.
And learned a ton. But there was then when we found out Lynn was pregnant, I was like, I can't do this. Like, I'm making like $11 an hour back then.
But you got free Slurpees though, right?
Yeah, we just went down to the franchise store, and in fact, it's funny you say that. We were very poor because I worked there for about a year after Logan was born, and they would bring samples in, food vendors would, and I would just like take them, like any leftovers, and I would go to this 7-Eleven and the franchise one nearby that was kind of the test store, and I would get stuff, and so we ate food samples often for dinner, which is funny and sad at the same time.
Yeah.
And there was this person that would used to come in and take our office supply order, and I'll remember her name was Tony. She had like cool, like early 90s spiked hair. She kind of looked like Demi Moore. And it was like, that's a fun job, because I've always, this nerdy to say, I've always loved office supplies. I used to go into Writer Brothers stationery store in Baker, Oregon, just for the smell and to see the pens and paper. I still am that way. Still got fancy pens and things like that. And so I asked her, I was like, how did you get paid? How does that work? And it was a company called J. Thayer, which was a family-owned business, been in business at that time 100 years. And the grandsons were running it. And I basically just bugged the one brother for, I don't know how long, 3 or 4 months, until he finally hired me on commission only. And and I was just good at it. I became the highest grossing first year salesperson in the history of the company.
Right.
Wow. So that was my first, like, I would say, like, career job. And then I worked a series of sales jobs from, that was 96 to sales jobs up until 2003. And when I became self-employed.
What was your learning process at that time? You're kind of in your early 20s, maybe mid 20s.
Yeah.
Never really sold before, I assume, but like, how did you like say, hey, I'm going to be the best salesperson this company's ever had,
Yeah.
and what do I do?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've never been asked that before. I didn't read a sales book, a book on sales, until I was probably 7 years later, and the reason I read it is I was the head of sales, and I was like, I better sound like I know what I'm talking about. So, like,
what book was it? Do you
uh,
remember?
I don't remember the sales book. It could have been, but it's interesting that the book, there was a book I read that I relied on heavily, and I read it when I was 10, and
wow.
it was How to Win Friends and Influence Others by Dale Carnegie. I was 10
yeah.
years old. It was in my grandmother's closet. I read that, and I read Barry Goldwater's Mind of a Conservative. That's what kind of nerd I was, around the same time.
There
Yeah.
you go.
Yeah. And so I honestly just used the things from that book, and it was very natural to me. And I remember I got to work with Andy Roddick a few years ago to help rebrand his foundation.
Sure.
And I asked him, when did he know he was going to be a tennis player? And he said that when his dad put the racket in his hand when he was 4 years old in Nebraska, and it just fit in his hand just perfectly. We built a whole campaign around called Find Your Fit. Right. And around that, which is pretty cool. But anyway, that was the first time. There was another time a number of years later when I became a branding guy that I had a similar feeling. But at that time, I was like, I'm good at this.
Yeah.
And people trusted me. I didn't lie. I was very charming, very persistent. I used to say to, the front desk person or the office manager, your job is to make me happy. My job is to make you look good.
Right.
So, stuff like that. And I just practiced these little one-liners, and, people would say, well, we're not interested. And I said, well, isn't it your job to save the company money? And they would be like, yeah. I said, well, how would you not be interested then? And it's funny, years later, The Office comes out with Dunder Mifflin, and I'm watching Jim and Dwight, and I'm like, I know all that stuff. That's pretty realistic.
That's
driving around like funny. That, just pitching people. Yeah.
That's great. So when did you kind of make that pivot into the kind of the marketing world? I mean, obviously sales and marketing are, tied hand in hand, but, it's a little different discipline.
Yeah. So I ended up in a couple of iterations, ended up being the VP of sales for a software company. And it was a wholly owned subsidiary of another company called Bandag, which was a retread manufacturer. They made retread, tire cappings and stuff. And they're now owned by Bridgestone Firestone. And the software was automation software for retread plants, and also automotive and tire stores too, but primarily retread plants. And there was a team of us that we decided we made a proposal to the company, to the parent company, to buy the software from them that was not related to the retread tool. It was called like Road Warrior or something like that. I don't remember, but it was for automotive shops. And they took our proposal and used it to sell us to ADP. So ADP bought us, and they didn't have a a VP position open, but they were going to give me a regional sales director position in Baltimore. And I was living in Boise, Idaho, by the way, at this time. And having been to Baltimore, I did not want to live in Baltimore. So no offense to Baltimoreans, but no. And so there was that, or take 6 months severance. That was the option. And so myself and two other guys, we took our severance and we started a company. And my main job was rainmaker. That's what I was good at. And I started bringing in deals, and then we found out, this is with a couple of years, scraping by, and got up to 21 employees, and making good money. And then one day in 2007, a IRS agent showed up and told us that why we hadn't paid our payroll taxes. And we found out that the managing partner, the person we as owners, the partner we had made the CEO or the managing partner, was stealing. And he wasn't just stealing money, he was taking payroll taxes and using it for personal expenses. And so we fired him, sort of. That's its own sort of funny story, actually. But because we had a rule in our operating agreement that you couldn't fire another partner without full consent. At that point, we had too many partners. The original three of us had expanded like 7 partners, and they
Right.
didn't want to. They were sort of like pacifists in some way, and so we basically just isolated him until he quit. And so, which is sort of funny. But anyway, we had this big client that I'd landed, and they were going to have their strategy session. I'd sat in these strategy sessions, but never led one. I often disagreed with the same guy that led the strategy sessions was also the CEO, and very arrogant, didn't really like input from anybody else unless, he would often say, stay in your lane. And I'm like, well, yeah, but you're full of shit. This doesn't make any sense, And so this person came in, she had signed the contract, paid, and it was, we couldn't give the money back because we didn't have it. And we were like, other partners, like, what are we going to do? I said, I'll do it. And that was the second, tennis racket in the hand moment. So in that session, she laughed, she cried, it was like, this is exactly what I was trying to articulate. And it was like this moment where you're like, oh, I thought I was good at sales. I'm really good at this.
Right.
And that just became a series of adventures after that.
Wow.
So, that was in 2000 and, like I said, 2007 when that happened.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I was going to talk about what you're doing now, but we don't need to go through like each year and each step. But
Yeah.
From that moment to today, what were your kind of big learnings and to get you where you are today?
Yeah, I mean, goodness, we'd need hours there,
Yeah.
but I'll try to like break it down of just, this is top of mind. Like, choose your partners wisely. That was a huge lesson. And choose who you partner with. Number 2 is there's no substitute for moral clarity. So this view I have about ethical branding and marketing, I've had for years. It's not new, with different circumstances, but it's not new. And so trust your intuition, trust the energy. There were many deals over the years up until, really, honestly, until 2022. There were many deals I made. We're fine people, but I just didn't believe it. There was no there. It was very transactional, I guess you could say. It was like running an agency, and I just didn't want to do that anymore. And so it was like, once the energy's gone, the energy's gone. And you can't gin it up. You can't manufacture it. It's like a sexless marriage. You just, once that happens, there's probably no going back. You're not suddenly going to reignite things.
Right.
And trusting that from the very beginning with a client where there's no passion for what they're doing, that was a huge lesson. And because to me, it's just not fun to help people go inward into their soul and find this thing and articulate, put it out, if you don't really vibe with them,
Right.
I think another important lesson is, and this is more related to intuition, is also, but just don't be the gimmick guy, especially in branding and marketing, which is full of gimmicks and stuff. And, I do a keynote called Blame It on Ed. And it's about Edwin Bartel, Freud's nephew, who was called the godfather of propaganda, where he took Freud's teachings and created the industry of PR, which were then adopted by Nazi Germany, and then Mao Zedong, and then Madison Avenue. Same stuff.
Right.
Same stuff. And it's this sense of like, clever at the sake of moral clarity isn't worth it. I'll put it that way. Don't fuck with people's souls when it comes to branding and marketing.
Right.
It's just not worth it.
Right.
And so those are some. I could give you 500 more, but those are the big ones that come to mind.
Yeah. Yeah. So talk about it. I think the first, just based on your LinkedIn, you started massive change in November of 2022. So talk about that process, why you did it, and we'll talk about new resistance roundtables and also.
Yeah.
Let's dive deep now.
Yeah. So just for context to this, is I had the company that, we had the issue with the IRS that went under. A buddy of mine and I started another company, and then he ended up getting a CMO job, and we're still great friends. So there was this iteration. I was the CMO of a startup that we took to exit, which was pretty cool. Never done that before. Got to go meet with the NFL and Fox News and these other big glitterati type companies with this app that we had.
And what was the app?
So
what did it do?
It was called Slide Cloud. And so if you've ever gone to a conference that's run by Freeman out of Dallas, which is the largest event company in the world, they use our app. That's the same app. Okay. Now it's obviously evolved since
it's monitoring feedback from the participants.
Cool. So we had 2 process patents, and that was fun. That was a fun gig. Anyway, but there was a time where I met Emily in 2014, and we just vibed like instantly. She was a client first. She was the head of marketing for a behavioral research company. So we started a company called Root and River, which really was all about, like, we called it Root and River because the root was in the soul and the river is out into the world. So that, branding and marketing. Branding starts at the root. Marketing is how you flow out into the world. But our relationship evolved significantly, and some heartache around that. And so Massive, though, was born kind of like, I didn't want to do what like I said, I didn't want to work with clients I didn't feel like were making a dent in the universe. And there were 3 moments that created this. The first was George Floyd's murder. That was like, there was something about that was like, I can't do this where we pretend like social, society, and business are separate. Can't do that. And then COVID happened, and that was its own weird, obviously, thing. And then I met Virginia, who is she was a guerrillera in the Nicaraguan revolution, and fighting against the Contras and Nicaragua, and a feminist and a PhD in complexity science, and really helped me see the concept of privilege systemically, not just like spiritually, like realizing that that injustice was systemic, not just not just something that is opinion, about, you could be, I could say, well, I'm not a racist or I'm not a sexist, but we're in systems that are by their nature systemic. There's systemic sexism, systemic racism, things like that. And so she had a coaching practice. I was doing kind of my own thing. And it's interesting. Generally, you say, don't go into business with your wife or your husband, but we did. And out of that, Massive was born. And it's really simple. It's really simple. What we do is, if you were trying to make a dent in the universe, in some sort of impact, you need executive coaching, you need leadership development, and you need brand strategy. So that's what we do. But we do it for what we call system shakers. So our clients some are nonprofits, some are social enterprises, some are regular companies run by people that have had their own kind of awakening to systemic issues. And so I take all of that brand strategy and I bring it to social impact companies or individuals. I do a lot of what I call branding for misfits. I do a lot of solo coaching now.
Love that title.
Thank you. Yeah. And it's the same thing I would do with a company, but or a nonprofit, but it's the same process. It's just obviously different when it's one-to-one. And I never have had more now, in life. I never had more moral clarity about what I'm here to do, what I believe, how to use my gifts, and also like joy of work. Like the projects I'm working on are so rewarding, exhausting because you're putting your soul into it. Right. But the joy of work is real for me now. And that's what I was looking for. I mean, it's an added bonus. I get to work with my amazing partner, but that's actually, kind of just an extra awesome thing. But the work itself and the clarity around it, moral clarity around it, that's the daily juice.
Are you drowning in boring corporate communications? Palacio and Partners is here to rescue you. We transform internal podcasts from snooze fest to must-listen content that actually connects your team and strengthens your culture. Imagine podcast episodes that make your employees laugh while staying informed. Our founder, Jeff Palacio, doesn't just create podcasts. he creates conversations that break through the noise. Whether you're a growing startup or a massive corporation, we turn your company's story into audio gold. Leadership becomes human. Remote teams feel connected. Your message cuts through the clutter. Palacio and Partners, where corporate communications gets a fun makeover. Let's make your podcast work harder than your email inbox ever could. Jeff is happy to share his insights on podcasting with you. You can contact him via LinkedIn or schedule a Zoom call via the link in the episode description.
You've exposed me I think we talked, February 18th. Today's the last day of February in 2025, the 28th. And, so in preparing, I'm on your email list now. I read your blogs, but you've exposed me to things like, SWAM, if I'm permitted, straight, white, American male.
American male, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Obviously I know a lot about, I'm exposed to DEI. I've hired over 300 people in my career. But yeah, I think just talk about some of these things that I know it's part of the massive change, but, your thoughts on, like guests for my podcast, for example, we're both, SWAMs, if I'm pronouncing it, like I said, pronouncing
you
it
are,
right,
yeah.
But, but I always look for diversity, right? I want people that have different, but I would say, even though you are a SWAM, you're very, your opinions are different. And I'd love to learn from you, and help some of the listeners of the podcast do the same in terms of, like, if you're, a white guy in leadership today, what kind of, I know you write about this, but what kind of highlights would you say to them in terms of how they can, change? And I know you talk about systemic liberation as part of massive. So talk about those things.
Well, thank you for that. And it's important to realize that we humans are three-dimensional creatures. We're animals. We got a nervous system. And that's got all the imprints of, like, just like any mammal or reptile has. So there's that. And there's some conditioning, environmental conditioning there. Like, that's where trauma comes from, for example. Like, trauma happens at the nervous system level. That's what makes it trauma. We use that term too loosely these days. We say trauma and we really mean drama, but real trauma happens at the nervous system level. And so that's the starting point for this, is every person that comes from what is typically called a traditionally marginalized group has experienced some form of trauma for who they are. Now, this is less the case for, let's say, white women with money. That's, so it's not all gender-based. And I'm using social labels so that we can transcend them.
Sure.
I'm using social labels because that's what we say now. We say Black, or we say Latino, or we say gay, or they're social labels. They're personal identities as well, which is fine, of course. But I use them to transcend them in many ways to get to, like, the deeper human part of this. And so, if you were to realize this, that it's what I call buffering. That if you are if you come from a place of privilege, and typically that would be straight white American male, often also then the extra one is being a Christian in the United States, or Christian background, or religious, you could say, in general. You have a sort of a buffer from your trauma because you have privilege, and you don't understand. You may not have ever been to therapy because you don't need to, because you're making money and things are working for you at a surface level. So that's the first step, is to understand the influence of trauma on people that are not, like, what would be considered not typical. So it's going to be people of color, neurodivergent people with a trauma background, whether that be complex trauma or like combat debt trauma, or people from the LGBT community, immigrants. Even if your skin color is white, being an immigrant is its own kind of, there's things associated with that they're expected to fit into a system that they didn't participate in creating. And we don't know, you and I mean, you as an Italian with heritage, your heritage knows what this is like, but most straight white American men don't. They don't know what that's like.
Sure.
So that's number one, is the nervous system stuff, just being aware of that. You don't have to be an expert in it, just be aware of it. That's all. Which includes then so a future guest I think you're going to have on, Massimo Bacchus is a client of mine. His book, Human First, Leader Second, it's about self-compassion. Well, there's a sort of namaste aspect to this as well, which is the divine in me sees the divine in you. Well, if I'm doing the work of self-compassion, then it's going to make me naturally more compassionate to other people.
Right.
It would be impossible for it not to. So that's where that's where some of that comes in. The second part of this is the neocortex, the human brain, the storyteller. So and that storyteller is really where social conditioning comes in. And the social conditioning in the US is, especially if you're white, is largely based off of a kind of whitewashed view of history combined with either some spectrum between secular, atheistic to very religious. Those are the two driving social shapers if you're a white male in particular in this country.
Right.
And so this is where, like, the work that Virginia does in particular around learning critical thinking. And critical thinking is to first be critical of your own thoughts, is this awareness that your thoughts are not really yours. They're they're influenced by these things. And if you come from a place of power dynamics or power centers, you have a set of stories and this is the thing, Jeff, this is where it gets really dangerous, is if your stories are also your identity, you are threatened by change.
Right.
And so it's that disassociation of like, oh, that's why I believe this. So one of the things I do with branding, because branding comes from the inside, is we find out what you actually believe, not what you were taught to believe.
Right.
Break down what we call intrinsic beliefs. That's some of the work that I do, because that's in the soul, that's the inner work. So it's kind of an awareness of the stories that you have about things. And this is where our political views come from largely, is the stories that we're told. And they're not usually examined all that much by most people. And then the third is the soul. And I use the soul the way Carl Jung used the soul, the term, or Carl Sagan, or even Einstein. There's scientists that use the term soul as this innate personhood. Whether or not there's a heaven, hell, God, Jesus, Buddha, I don't know. We all have our beliefs. But there is something that people talk about. If you've ever witnessed someone pass away, on their deathbed, you can see something happen where they become a body, and when there's something, just laying there. Well, we have in the Western world, especially in the industrial age, we have a lot of thinking that suppresses the soul in order to go up and to the right with the progress, or the numbers, or growing the business, or making a living. We subjugate the soul and we don't really listen to it. And so you can look at this as kind of like three different kinds of consciousness. And I'll go backwards from here. I'll start with soul. That's like spiritual consciousness. That's the stuff that's like, Buddhism or Christ consciousness, or we get really deep into that stuff like that. That's just much more spiritual, mystical, let's call it. And then you have intellectual consciousness, which is like an awareness that you are not your thoughts and feelings. This is kind of the Sam Harris school of, that from that area of consciousness. And then you've got systemic consciousness. And systemic consciousness is really about the nervous system, which is a complex adaptive system. And systemic consciousness is just awareness of how parts interact with each other. And so each of those are their own little paths that someone can go down to be a better human being. And what I believe, and what Virginia believes, is that those three paths are the responsibility of a modern leader to do that work. And you'll learn this from Massimo. He views it very similarly. He calls with the help that working with me, he calls it a self-actualizing enterprise. That if enough people are practicing self-compassion, eventually there's a kind of autonomy, a systemic autonomy that happens, where the whole organization becomes self-actualizing. Last thing, it's a lot of words here, is this is going to be scary and terrifying. It's going to challenge things. It's going to offend you. The more offended you are, the closer you are to the truth inside yourself. It's going to hurt emotionally. It's going to hurt to do this work. And that's why your best friend in this whole process is curiosity. It's really difficult to be offended and curious at the same time.
Right.
And to just ask the questions of yourself and others. What do I believe? What are we doing? All this, just question. And what will come out the other end is this realization that you have a set of gifts and talents that are in some way supposed to contribute to the advancement of humanity. And there's a saying, I don't know who said it, but sometimes to have your new life, you got to kill your old life. There's an element of that here too, but then you have this epiphany, this moment where you're like, holy shit, I don't believe any of this. I don't want to do this. I need to do this instead.
Right.
But it's all scary as hell to do it, which is why most people don't, honestly, especially people with money and, a little bit of status, a little bit, it's a little easy. It's easy. Like, why do I need to change? Like, it's working for me.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you said something about therapy, but I'm like people that like, there's hardly anybody that doesn't need therapy, in my opinion. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah. It all depends on intention. Like, I think I'll put it this way. Everybody needs needs inner work. How you get there.
Right.
Is, sometimes it's therapy if you're doing like, cognitive behavior therapy or internal family systems type trauma-informed therapy. It depends, but it's like my thing I say to white dudes all the time, especially in business, you are not who you think you are.
Right. Yeah.
They don't like that.
Sure. Yeah. It's just so interesting. I mean, I listened to your, Third Wave podcast, a recent one on, something about silence and not
the cost of silence.
The cost of silence. Thank you. And it was just interesting because I don't consider myself a political person. Like there's some people that love everything politics and they love every, November presidential election, everything leads up to it. And I find it exhausting. And I know one thing I mean, there's so many good things about, it's a 10-minute, basically you talking about the cost of silence. But what I really liked about it, it pointed out some things for me as well as, it's usually either or, unfortunately, friends would, not be friends with somebody if they wanted a different political candidate. But what I liked about what you were talking about on that is, it wasn't just like, okay, Trump and Musk and all that shit that goes on. It automatically means I'm going to just do everything from a Democratic Party. Because that's what, for me, we don't get the best and the brightest to be presidents of the United States anymore. Whatever you want to say, like, I don't know. It's just so, but so talk a little bit. You're going to, talk about it in a way that I can't explain it. But so,
So I like the way you set things up, though. It's you're good at that, and it's a great skill to have as a podcast host. Is we have to look at this through a complexity science lens. And if there's people listening haven't heard of complexity science, just go look it up. Go ask ChatGPT, and that'll be 99% accurate about what it is. And it's this, but I will say in the lens of politics. Politics has been informed by institutions, which are not complex adaptive systems by their nature. They like hierarchy and structure and don't change, and they're very binary. And this is a big rule of complexity science: is you cannot solve a complex problem with a binary solution.
Right.
Well, left versus right, Republican versus Democrat is about as binary as you can get.
Right.
And so this is like on Substack, where I do most of my writing, this is where I'm offending a lot of progressives, because I'm saying to them, you're part of the reason we're here too, is that you think that most Americans are progressive when it comes to social issues. Doesn't mean they're progressive when it comes to economic issues. Most people don't want to eliminate billionaires per se, maybe certain billionaires, but for different reasons.
Right.
But it's this challenge of like, we have to transcend if we're going to move forward and into, we like to say, it's easy to say like build a new way, but you don't really build a new way in complexity science. You just facilitate a new way to emerge. So it's the science of emergence. It's the same thing. Well, to do that, you got to get rid of your binary shit, and you got to understand where power dynamics come from. In this country, I love this country. It's an amazing place. And it was built on a perpetual war between liberators and controllers. It's been that way since before 1776. And thankfully, the liberators wrote the Constitution. They were deeply flawed people and slave owners, and that's all true. That's a messy part of the messy truth. But they were liberators in the sense of building a document. But Washington warned in his farewell address about political parties, of what they would do. And I encourage everyone to go read his farewell address, and you'll be like, oh, well, that's how this problem started. In order to get to simplicity, you've got to cross through complexity first. You got to understand the complexity of something before you can look at it. And I don't mean simplistically or reductionist, but and really what it is that people say the country is divided. It is, but it's divided into kind of three, not two. It's MAGA, and it's the apathetic, and everybody else. The political machinery that has been the Democrats, in particular in this case, or there is no Republican Party anymore. It's dead. It would be unrecognizable by Reagan or somebody like that. Right. As someone, I grew up a conservative, and I still, in many ways, as far as the use of government, am a conservative. But the Republican Party is dead, and it's not coming back. The Democrat Party needs to shift from being a political party to being a complexity science-based think tank, which is, how can all the people that are not apathetic and are not MAGA people, how can we work together to create something or let it evolve into something new and better? And this is where business comes in. Businesses, entrepreneurs by their very nature are innovative. And Mark Cuban talks a lot about this, because he's very anti-Trump, and so that he's not the only one, but he's one of my favorites as a SWAM himself. Right. We speak a similar language. Is we can't keep repackaging the same things over and over again and hoping that something's going to change in the way that we do things. And business, and he points this out, and others do too, is that businesses, we understand iteration better than anybody else. Entrepreneurs do. We understand creativity. We understand listening to feedback loops. We understand keeping things fresh. Like if we just took the great business thinkers of our time, from like Drucker to Marshall Goldsmith, and we compiled all of their learnings and applied it to the current political climate, we would look back and go, why the fuck are we doing any of this stuff? It's all so stupid.
Right.
Because if it was a business, it's that you end up in that sort of like too big to fail. And then it's like I say, like there's no coincidence that the people that became billionaires off of the system are Trumpies, including Trump and Musk. The billionaires that grew up and they grew up poor, they grew up working at McDonald's and selling brushes door to door like Cuban did, and many of these other billionaires that are anti-Trump, certainly the system benefited them, but they didn't start off 100 miles ahead of everybody else because they got tax subsidies or government contracts or millions of dollars from their dad.
Right.
Those are the people that are, to me, the collective of entrepreneurs. Collectively, not one of them, but collectively, they have the answers about what to do. But imagine this, Jeff. They have the answers of what to do, but then you go to the progressive side and they're like, capitalism is terrible and you're the problem, and blah 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 blah, all that sort of like the what I call the liberal version or the progressive version of purity culture. That doesn't help.
Right.
We have to compete in the open market with ideas that people actually want, and that's what business people know how to do.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and I think the other thing is that whatever party it is, they don't do what's best for the people anymore. They both do what the party wants.
That's right.
And that's terrible.
And I will give the Democrats credit. They were on the wrong side of history when it came to like the Soviet Union and communism and all that. And they kind of self-corrected. I will give them credit for being on the right side of history when it comes to like human rights. Considering that the majority of the Democrat Party prior to the 1960s was in the South and extremely racist and remnants of the Confederacy, that's a pretty big turnaround.
Right.
And so I give them credit for that. So just keep evolving, because I get this a lot. Well, when are the Republicans going to do something? I'm like, well, which ones? There's no Republicans left with any sort of like governing power. You still got Adam Kinzinger and Mitt Romney and people that are critics, but there's none left in government.
Right.
So it's going to be up to us, and us is the collective opposition, not the political party. It's the political party is largely irrelevant now. Thank God.
Right.
So that's why I say I give Trump credit for this. He broke the political system. That needed to happen. I wanted to do something. And so in January, I launched the New Resistance Roundtables. It's very simple. It's a group of entrepreneurs and business leaders that are committed to opposing, resisting, and eventually replacing the system that created Trump. And it's based off of 3 principles, which is unified resistance. We're not trying to problem solve. We're just trying to resist right now. Number 2 is the adoption of free market principles as part of the solution, not repackaged stuff from the past, from an Elizabeth Warren white paper. And the 3rd is you got to be an activist. You can't just like post stuff on Facebook, because you've got to be an activist. And if you're a business leader, there's so many ways to be an activist, which I'll be publishing the next article that will go out. I don't know when this will broadcast or be published, but I'll be doing an article on March 7th about 10 things that a business leader can do to actually resist, to be an activist.
Yeah, no,
so being an ally is not enough. You have to be an activist now if you're opposed to him.
So talk about the resist part. Like, so what is that? Like, what's some examples of the resist, that piece of it?
Most straight white American men have never learned how to be an activist. They didn't necessarily need to, unless they had some very specific thing, like they were anti-war or something like that, or pro this or that. But those were more protests than a type of resistance. So this is a type of how to be an active part of the opposition, which is other countries have learned this over the years, that have been, because this is just pretty normal, this kind of instability. Resistance is going up to and over the line into civil disobedience. It's as John Lewis said about getting in good trouble. Like, so look at Rosa Parks. That wasn't something she just decided to do that day. It was a strategy that, if you go to the history, she was part of the NAACP chapter in that town in Alabama, and it was a strategy. So it's being strategic and intentional about what you will resist. And so you could go pretty far in this conversation about what you could do as a business owner, but one of the main things you can do is make it very, very clear with your brand who you're for and who you're against. That is its own kind of resistance, because as a history nerd, I can say this for sure. Authoritarianism, yes, they oppress the dissenters, but there's not enough dissenters in order to actually change anything. So they oppress them. What they really rely on is the privileged to stay silent. So you look at during Germany in the 1930s and all the big companies, some of them are still around today, Bayer and BMW, they relied on them to be silent long enough for them to benefit from the oppression. So we have this like spot in history in this moment now where the very act of taking a stand is a form of resistance, because it's a signal out to other people. That's why I give so much praise to Mark Cuban and Mark Benioff and other CEOs and founders that are out there that are Reid Hoffman is another one. They're very opposed to Trump. And another one is give your employees and your customers access to resources related to their rights. So this is a big one that is especially with the mass deportation, which has turned out to be a sputtering nothing burger for most, mostly political theater, partially because there were so many employers that told their employees what their rights were. And I'll use there are many examples of this that you can go look for, of companies putting out an email or a letter to their employees saying, these are your rights. You do not have to talk to ICE. There's no reason you have to talk to them. If you do have to talk to them, we will provide you an attorney. And people don't realize this. In the United States, if you're here, regardless of how you got here, you are protected by the Constitution. That's in the Constitution. Number 2 is being here illegally is not a felony. It's a misdemeanor. It's like getting a traffic ticket. It's this illusion that it's some horrific crime. From a statutory standpoint or a legal standpoint, it's not. And so what happens is that there's a whole bunch of people, a bunch of white dudes in particular, that are like, oh, I didn't even know we had those rights. Well, talk about privilege to not know your rights. You talk to a Latino, generally they know their rights unless it comes to ICE, because there's ICE uses with Latinos the social conditioning of fear. The thing that they escaped. Most people in the last 10 years that have come to the United States illegally have come not from Mexico. The majority of them have come from Central America and Venezuela and Cuba because of oppression, because of dictatorships.
Right.
And so they are conditioned to be afraid of authority. And here the ICE comes along, and those fuckers know what they're doing. And so as an employer, as an act of resistance, if ICE shows up, you don't have to give them access to your employee records or any of that stuff, or Doge. If they show up and they tell you that you can't do DEI, as Jasmine Crockett said, we all need to learn how to say, go fuck yourself in some specific way. And that is resistance. Just saying, no, I know what my rights are, because it's the little whispers of within people of privilege, people in positions of power, like business leaders, the little whispers of that's polarizing, or we shouldn't say that, or leave business but work and home at home. That's what I talked about. That's what they rely on. Right. So saying something is resistance.
Yeah. So good. Justin, I could go on and on, but I love to help two groups of people. And one of those is a recent college graduate, because most universities, college teach you how you get your degree in marketing or accounting or engineering, but how to get a job and navigating your job search and becoming a great professional. I think they fall a little short in that area. What advice would you have for a recent college graduate that's trying to get their first job?
It's not going to be hard to get your first job. It's going to be, what the difficult part is, to find a place where you feel like you can grow and evolve. So it doesn't really matter what the work is if you can pay your bills. And you in your 20s, and I learned this the hard way by being a dad at 22, you got to buy your freedom, and you got to do it as soon as you can. So if you're locked in to some sort of culture you don't like, some sort of like product you don't give a shit about, whatever, if you're gonna get paid to be miserable, go do something that's actually fun and get paid less. So focus on where you feel like you can grow and thrive, and seek mentors. You just reach out to me, and if you want to be mentored, I'll mentor you. Seek mentors, because the advice you get from people about your career is mostly wrong. It's because it's about conformity. Mm-hmm. And conformity is the enemy of growth. You can't conform and grow at the same time.
Right. That other group I love helping is, if you remember that first time that you were responsible for a group of people, like you were head of, the best salesperson at the office supply company, you're an individual contributor, but that first time you had a group of people under you, and now you're responsible for a team. What advice would you have for those people?
Well, first of all, I have two things. One is if you have if you've undealt with childhood trauma, you got to go get help, because if you don't, you will take it out on your employees. You may not want to, but as Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will govern you, and you will call it fate. Most harm done in business cultures is done by leaders, not that have poor training, but that have not done the inner work to fix their shit.
Yeah.
So that's one. Number two is find out what the real motivators are. Find out what your team really wants individually. I learned that as a young sales manager, 32 years old, running a sales team of 30 people, all different walks of life and backgrounds and ages and genders and ethnic backgrounds. Underneath all of those labels, we just want stuff. And I remember this one kid named Travis, young guy, and he wanted a boat. So I built his performance plan around him getting a boat, and he got a boat. And another guy wanted to do this, a person wanted to do this. I mean, just find out what people's motivations are, because it's such a beautiful way to understand them. That's its own kind of hearing and being seen, is when you understand your motivations and you know that your boss or your leader has your back related to those motivations.
Right.
Because now it's not about hitting the numbers. It's about reaching the goal that you have. This is why I always watch the Super Bowl ceremony, the trophy ceremony, even if I don't care about the teams, or I watch it because most of them are millionaires. Some of them have won it before, and they're kissing and laughing and crying. And This is beautiful photo. This is going to sting because it's about Jalen Hurts. but of him sitting in the locker room with his goggles from the champagne like off his neck, smoking a cigar, sitting on the floor, holding the trophy and looking at it.
Yeah.
Well, as Dimitri Martin, the comedian, says, I didn't know I was athletic until I found out I could buy trophies. Like they could have the money to go just buy themselves a pretend trophy to feel better about themselves. A lot of people do that, especially
Right.
in their relationships and their stuff. But to know that motivation and attach it to a goal as a leader is one of the most empowering things you can do.
Yeah.
It's life-changing to know to be able to help someone understand their motivations and help them get there.
Yeah, that's so good. Justin, thank you so much. I'm honored that you came on the Corporate Couch, and I'm so grateful that Mackie and Mark introduced me to you. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I love the serendipity of how we met, and I look forward to many more of these, hopefully in person, not necessarily even recorded, that we just get to hang out and talk. So
yeah, sounds good.
I appreciate you. Thank you, Joe.
Joe, I'm not really sure what to say about Justin. I always re-listen to the recording to prepare for our outro, and I wrote so much stuff down. I mean, just it's just such a diverse career, and like I said, he's the least corporate person that's been on the Corporate Couch, outside of Kamal Kaur, the 18-year-old at the time, founder of the Eye of the Immigrant, who had not had a corporate career yet. But yeah, what would surprise people about him and all that stuff, and just his upbringing, and he's just a deep thinker. I mean, we've had obviously brilliant people on the Corporate Couch, but he's definitely one of those. I just learned a lot. He was just a different type of thinker. Now I identify as a SWAM, I guess, a straight white American male. And what I liked about him, he goes, yeah, I'm 54, I got a shaved head, and I'm the archetype of, the person that caused all the problems today. I think he said it. He also called himself an enlightened redneck because he was from some kind of farm in Eastern Oregon. Worked for Nike in the prototype department. He had to get scanned and searched so he wouldn't steal any of the Nike prototypes. Goes from a 7-Eleven, male admin assistant for 4 executives, and he exited a company, made money, made me go look at Washington's farewell address about how Washington warned against the 2-party system. I literally, researched it. I'm like, and what Washington said in 1796 in this his last farewell address, or I guess his only farewell address, was like, it's dead on of what has happened because of the 2-party system. Just, the parties are doing things for themselves, not for the people, is the bottom line. I mean, yeah, and he's just a different type of thinker, and I think, he really wants compassion, both, for others, and self-compassion, and, he talks about, the soul conscious, intellectual consciousness, systematic consciousness. I mean, just he's amazing on a lot of different levels. I don't know if he drinks, but I'd love to have a glass of wine or sipping some tequila and continue our conversation. But yeah, he was just fantastic for me. I just learned a lot in our discussion. Joe, let me guess, you're going to talk about what The Office and his mention of Dunder Mifflin.
Oh, Dunder Mifflin, yeah, and his whole affection for office supplies. I know exactly what he's talking about. When I was in high school and college, I loved going to the office supply store. And I love the smells that are in there. The smell of the lead of the pencils, and the smell of the freshly minted notebook paper and things like that. I loved the mimeograph paper when we would get tests at school. Remember that Blue Spirit mimeograph paper? I just loved that stuff. Now I didn't use that to go into a career in sales like he did, but man, I understand exactly what he was talking about with that. Yeah. I did when one of the first corporate jobs that I had, I was in charge of purchasing all of the office supplies for the computer department. So, and this would have been in the early 80s. I was buying green bar paper, if you remember that. And if you remember that we would print invoices on these great big printers, and these 4-ply invoices where there's a yellow copy and a blue copy and a turquoise pink copy and everything like that. And with these carbonless forms, open up a box of those and the smell comes out from those carbonless forms. And I just absolutely love that thing.
Joe, about 60-70% of the people listening do not know what the hell you're talking about.
I know. And I think that's unfortunate because during my term of making all those purchases, we converted most of that stuff to laser printers. And so I ended up just buying boxes and boxes and boxes of 8.5 by 11 paper. And that's what it turned out to be.
There you go.
So, but at the beginning of that career, it was a wonderful career.
Well, and the other thing, so, he went from, he got married at 18, had his first child at 21, 22. But so, he's just immediately trying to make money, right, for his family. And he went from that 7-Eleven admin assistant job to just kept bugging those office supply family members. Give me a job. Gets it. Sales job, first sales job, 100% commission, becomes the number one highest grossing salesperson. So just amazing person. And it sounds like him and his partner, his wife, with this massive change movement and coaching practice are going to do great
If there's
things.
anybody that we have interviewed, first of all, I think I agree with you that he is one of the most intelligent, or certainly in the top 10 intelligence people that we've ever interviewed. But he is the one who has found his thing, right?
Right.
He has found what he's supposed to be doing, and he is doing it.
Right.
And so, no matter what you think about what he's doing, he found a new wife, found a business partner, found a path in life, and I think I gotta commend him for that. I think it's great.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, because the other thing, he gave some great career advice, and it was basically related to a sexless marriage. So he was in this marketing agency, they were doing well, but he goes, I wasn't passionate about it anymore. And he goes, it's just like a sexless marriage. Like, you can't be, have that type of relationship for years and then reignite the passion. It's not going to happen. And he said that basically about his career. Like, yeah, everything was great, but it was just there, and I didn't want it. I wanted passion for something. So
and when that happens, you've got to relieve yourself of that circumstance and go on.
Joe, what advice would you want to give our great listeners today?
It's not so much advice this time, but I want to tell you a little story. That I went out to dinner last night, and you'd be interested in this. I had a little conversation with the waitress, and she said, "I'm glad you enjoyed your dinner. How did you find the steak?" And I said it was real easy. It was right next to the potatoes.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Corporate Couch. If you enjoy the podcast, I would love for you to take 2 minutes out of your day to rate us 5 stars and write a review. Please join me next week to learn from another great leader sharing their professional journey and insights.